if you're interested in inner work, potentially dabbled in your own personal healing and self-growth, maybe you've filled notebooks full of journal entries, maybe you've tried meditating, maybe you have sought out therapists and counselors to help you deal with certain issues, maybe you have done your own shadow work or trauma work. And whilst many of these areas can be incredibly enriching, can give you a new insight into yourself and your role in the world, oftentimes it doesn't necessarily change the external circumstances, especially when it comes to forging your path in the world. And that's why I want to talk to you about action therapy. And my name is Joel Yuli. I'm a philosopher. I am deeply obsessed with callings and vocations and knowing our paths in the world and then being able to walk them in the 21st century. And that's why I'm here. That's why I educate people on social media, places like Instagram. That's why I have a podcast called the Career Archetypes Podcast. That's why I'm on YouTube and on Substack sharing this message, because it's so important to realize that the majority of our adult life is spent working, and we have to do meaningful work in the world. Otherwise, it will feel as though we're not doing what it is that we're called for. And this can be a depressing and also a decaying feeling. And that's why I show people step by step how to unearth their very own career archetype in my Unearth membership, where it shows you how to contact this pattern within you that can inform you of your path. And I've noticed that time and time again, the members that I work with, they have gone through different forms of healing work. They have confronted certain patterns, certain traumas, certain roots within themselves that required a reinvestigation, a moment of soothing, a reinterpretation that would allow them to move forward. And yet it didn't. I remember I was talking to a student, this was a few years ago, and in the conversation, she said that she'd been going to therapy for every single week for 3+ years. And in hearing that, she sort of saw my sort of face when I was like, well, so what happened? Because she had been going to therapy primarily to sort out her career path and her vocation. And she said that she often gathered tools that were useful to her in the moment or would help her deal with the immediate reality around her. And yet she would inevitably find herself counting down the hours. She would inevitably find herself still being at a job that she didn't deeply feel called for. There was no amount of talking about her boss. There was no amount of talking about her relationship with her mother. There was no amount of talking about the friends in her friendship group that didn't quite see the world in the way in which she saw it, that could help to ease this in such a way where she felt as though she could come out into the world, where she could be seen or she could pursue her path in a way that she felt was deeply aligned. In fact, what the therapy had done for her was it just further confused what her actual path was. It sort of seemed to tell her that, hey, you should just stay put and learn to deal with this situation. And really, it's you that is the problem as opposed to the very environment that you're in. And this is one of the sort of issues with this kind of work, is that it constantly wants you to go deeper in. It constantly wants you to go more introspective. It constantly wants you to map out your inner terrain. And that is an incredibly useful thing to do. You need to do that in your life to not have an awareness of your own inner terrain that's to be walking in the world blind. But you also need to have this expression that comes out into the world. You need to be able to forge yourself and assert yourself in the world. And this is where this idea of action therapy started to emerge in my practice and in the way that I started to help people be able to not only know what their calling is, but also to go out into the world and actually start to do it. And so action therapy, in the way that it works, is it looks for a particular barrier on your route towards what it is that you want. So once you define what it is that you want in this life, right? And in the case of not knowing what that is, you first have to find what that is. In the worst case scenario, if you don't know what that is, you also know what you don't want. So you can define what it is that you don't want, and that will show you what to avoid. But you know what you want in this life. And then there are going to be these particular barriers along the way to what it is that you want. And I mean this in the sense of there are real physical barriers or situational barriers, but more commonly, the reason that people are unable to change their life circumstances is because they can't articulate or they can't properly define the psychological barrier that is hindering them. And these different psychological barriers can look like the desire to be loved, the wanting to fit in with a certain social group, the fear of being judged the moment that they go and pursue their path, this internal worry that simply by showing parts of themselves that they haven't already before, that other people will come in and seek to destroy those parts of themselves that they might hold more dear than that which they're showing to the world already. And so these barriers need to be identified if we're ever to say, okay, this is the barrier, this barrier is not true, or this barrier needs to be reinterpreted, because by it staying as an obstacle, you're unable to ever reach your higher, what I would call as your exalted form, this state of being where you are truly embodying and aligning yourself in the world that is connected to your inner calling. And so you have to identify what that barrier is. Once you identify it, you reinterpret it. So as an example, if your barrier was the fear of being loved, and so therefore you are hiding parts of yourself, you'd reinterpret it in such a way that would say, like, you're not being loved for the person that you really are. You're being loved as a persona. You're being loved as a false expression, or maybe even like a half expression of who you are. And you need to show the world who you truly are if you are to ever have the chance of being fully loved. And therefore to pursue your path is not only an act of work or an act of calling, but it's an act of self-love. And by connecting to that act of self-love, that might bring your barrier down so that you can start to walk towards your path. And so you have to begin to notice what this barrier is, reinterpret it, and then you've got to start doing micro actions in the world that can take you closer to where it is that you want to go. So it's not as though you have to take action in such a way that it's gigantic, or that it's this monumental moment where it's very visible in the world. Oftentimes, when it comes to action therapy, it's more about just doing micro small actions that slowly cause you to reevaluate the very barrier that you thought was holding you back in the first place. And so to put this in an example, let's say that your desire was to bring yourself out and share your creative work on social media, but you didn't want to share it because you feared being judged. Maybe you fear being judged by your family or your friends, or you worry even that the workplace that you're in, someone, say for example your manager, might see that work and they might judge it. They might judge it in a negative way, like, why are you even pursuing this artistic career? You're already here in this profession, and they might have this inclination towards telling you what it is that you shouldn't be pursuing, and yet that's the very thing that you are meant to be pursuing. And so you fear that, you worry about that potentially happening. But to reinterpret that, you would say that this idea of being judged, or the psychological barrier of being judged, well, anyone that's ever walked a path that has been soul-led, they inevitably are judged. And not only are they inevitably judged, but they are inevitably judged in a bad way and a good way. So therefore, to walk your path means that everyone who has gone through that has to be judged, and they have to learn to deal with being judged. And not only do they have to learn to deal with being judged, but that it's doable because someone else has done it. And also they receive a great praise and reputation and status simply by following their path. And so a judgment can be handled. And you just need to go through that process of putting yourself out there, and eventually you learn to get a bit of a harder skin, and you learn to be able to deal with things that you thought you could never deal with before. And so this can occur when it comes to your action therapy. And then rather than, say, simply posting on social media for the world to see, you might say, for the next 7 days, I'm going to create 7 posts, and I'm just going to show my very, very close friend who I already know is incredibly positive and will support me no matter what. And that gives you a little bit of momentum. And then you might expand a little bit, show a few more people in the next 7 days. And then you might expand a little bit more to the point where you eventually start putting yourself out on social media. And the cool thing with this is that not only does it begin to heal this wounding of fear around being judged by others and reinterprets it in your mind, but it also allows you to change your external reality. And your work and your vocation requires a public presence, not simply in terms of being on social media or anything like that, but it requires an other. Someone else has to see it. Someone else has to be able to use it, be able to work with it. There's always an other that interacts with your work. So this is inevitable as you start to walk your path and you start to walk towards a state of mastery. And this can always be figured out. You can always navigate this. There's always a way around this. However, if you're constantly going internally, if you're constantly introspecting, if you're constantly saying, hey, I need to get to the root cause of this issue in my inner domain, what happens is that you end up getting stuck internally, where you're unable to properly express yourself externally. And yet, by expressing yourself externally, it ends up healing these internal factors and these internal barriers that are there. And so if you are someone that finds yourself in a place where you've grown and you've gone through your own personal healing internally, but your external situation is sort of the same, or it hasn't improved at the level at which you thought you would be at this point in your life, I would highly encourage you to think seriously and maybe map out your own personal action therapy task. And by doing that, what you'll end up inevitably seeing is that you can heal through your expression in the world. You can even find more of yourself by coming into contact with the world. And you can find edges that you never would have seen before had you have stayed within. And this is incredibly powerful when it comes to forging your path in the world and making your own path a reality. And if you're interested in learning more about how I help people to unearth their career archetype, which is this pattern that holds your calling, your purpose, your vocation, then you can check out the Unearth membership. In there, I have a course that walks you through all the steps in order to unearth your career archetype, as well as align it with the modern world and align it with the 21st century so that you can properly express yourself whilst simultaneously be able to make sure that you are financially secure and you have a lifestyle that you feel is deeply yours and deeply connected to the life that you want to lead.